G'day everybody, Ray Munday here, Team Associated J Concepts Reedy down here in Australia, and today I'm going to talk about weight transfer. Now, weight transfer is one of the most misunderstood topics in vehicle dynamics, in my opinion. In fact, it's so misunderstood that the name is actually incorrect. Weight transfer is actually what happens when you're like riding a bike and you literally shift your weight around. In vehicles, you can't do that. What we're actually experiencing is load transfer, but we'll stick with the name weight transfer to start with. It's a pretty simple topic, but it's quite complex when you get into the details. So I'm going to split this over two videos. The first video today is going to be on the static weight transfer. What causes weight transfer? How can you control it? And work through some examples in both acceleration and cornering. In the follow-up video, I'm going to talk about dynamic weight transfer, which is when you start to then involve the effect of the springs, the shocks, and the roll centers on the speed of weight transfer. One thing I'll start with though is that weight transfer is something that we're stuck with. It's part of physics. You can't change the laws of physics, you can control them a little bit. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into a little bit of the background of what causes weight transfer. To do this, I've got my trusty B6.3D, my Team Associated two-wheel drive buggy here. And I'd like to start with what is the basic cause of weight transfer. And it comes down to as simple as this. Basic laws of physics. I'm not going to go too complex. But basic laws of physics is that to accelerate a mass, the mass takes a force to accelerate. Now in a vehicle, the center of gravity of a two-wheel drive is right around here, about 45 mil above the ground. So when we're trying to move the vehicle, all of the forces of the vehicle that tries to resist movement, the mass of the vehicle, have to go through the center of gravity. But it's our tires that are giving the force. So the tires are down on the ground and the center of gravity is up above the ground. And it's this difference in height, the height of the center of gravity, that causes the weight transfer. So when we take the example of accelerating, our tire is going to be pushing forward at ground level. So it's going to create a force pushing this way. The same force will be resisted by the center of gravity this way. So you've now got one force pushing here and another force pushing high up here. So two forces pushing against each other like that creates a moment that's trying to twist the vehicle. And to resist that moment, what happens is that the rear tires now, because that the dynamics are trying to twist the car, there's what's called a weight transfer, and this will try to make the rear force get higher and the front force get lower to stop that moment. To explain that a little bit more, I've got a diagram here. So we have here the center of gravity of the vehicle and the front and rear tires and the tire force in red. So when we're accelerating, that tire force pushes along the ground level. The same force is resisted by the center of gravity. That moment, the force times the height of the center of gravity tries to roll the vehicle or pitch the vehicle backwards. That results in a weight transfer. And the maths are very simple for weight transfer. It's as simple as the force multiplied by the height of the center of gravity divided by the space between the wheels. So when we're talking acceleration, it's force times the height of the center of gravity divided by the wheelbase. When we're talking cornering, the same situation occurs, but it's the force times the center of gravity height divided by the track width or the spacing between the tires. Now you'll notice here, there's no suspension on this diagram. It doesn't matter whether we've got suspension or not. We have weight transfer. And that's one of the things that's quite misunderstood about weight transfer. Some people think weight transfer is because the car is pitching and the center of gravity moving. That's not the case. Weight transfer happens if you've got a go-kart. There's no suspension on a go-kart. It still has weight transfer because you've got the tire acting on the ground and a center of gravity up here. What the suspension does is show us sometimes how far or how much weight transfer there is. But the weight transfer is always there. We can't avoid it. It's part of physics. Unless you can magically make the center of gravity be on the same height as the tires, you're going to have weight transfer. What we can do, if you look at the maths though, is control it a little bit. If you've got a lower center of gravity height, you're going to have less weight transfer. If you've got, say, a longer wheelbase, you're going to have less weight transfer. If you have a shorter wheelbase, you'll get more weight transfer. Now, weight transfer is something we're stuck with. We can't get away from it, but there are ways we can use it to help our driving, and if we understand it, we can help with our setup. So I'm going to jump into a couple of examples for both acceleration and cornering to explain that. Now, before I jump into this, it might be worth to go back, if you haven't seen it before or you haven't seen it recently, to watch the video I did a while back on generating tyre traction and some of the fundamental principles of the way tyres develop traction. I'll link that in the video below. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to use, firstly, the example of accelerating with my B6.3D. Now, in this case, the vehicle weight is about 1,600 grams. The wheelbase is about 280 millimeters. The center of gravity height I've measured is about 45 millimeters above ground. And I'm going to use the example of a 1.5G acceleration. So we're going to be accelerating the car forward. Before we start accelerating, when we put the car on the ground, we have the blue figures are the weight that sits on the static weight of the vehicle. So 1,600 grams goes down through the center of gravity. Now I've put here a weight distribution of 40% on the front and 60% on the rear, which is a pretty typical point we run. So that means you have 640 grams here on the front axle and 960 grams on the rear axle. That's when the car's sitting flat. When we then accelerate, and we're accelerating here at 1.5G, that means we need to have a tyre force that's equivalent to 1,600 grams by 1.5G. The green figures show the weight transfer. In this case, 1,600 grams times 1.5G times the height of the center of gravity divide the wheelbase. We end up with a weight transfer of 385 grams. So in this case, 385 grams is now being added to the rear tyres and 385 grams is coming off the front tyres. The total weight of the car is the same, but we've been able to see that we now have more weight on those rear tyres under acceleration. So after that, they're now at 255 grams on the front, so it's dropped down quite a lot, and now 1,345 on the rear. So we've actually gone from a weight distribution that was 40% to around 16%. Now, if you recall back to the video I did on tyre traction, the more weight that's on a tyre, the more traction it has. So actually what's happened in this case is weight transfer is helping us in a two-wheel drive car. We've gone from 960 grams on the rear tyre. By accelerating and having weight transfer, we've now got 1,345 grams on the tyre. We've now got more traction on that rear tyre. And if you recall, in that video, I talked about the technique of increasing the throttle smoothly. So you're actually putting weight onto the rear tyre. As you put more weight on the rear tyre, you can accelerate harder. As you accelerate harder, more weight goes in the rear tyre. If you just punch it off the line, you've only got 960 grams worth of traction. Once you smoothly accelerate, you've now got 1,345 grams. So this is how we can use weight transfer to our advantage on a two-wheel drive. And that's why sometimes in low grip, you'll see us do things like shuffle either the weight back, which puts a bit more weight on the rear tyre, shuffle the wheelbase forward so we get a shorter wheelbase. And even that's why in low grip, sometimes it helps to have a center of gravity up a little bit higher. That gets more weight transfer to the back. Now, no prep drag racing is another part of RC that's growing really quickly right now. This is what it's all about, boys and girls, is weight transfer under acceleration. So you can play with the amount of weight that you got on the tyre and that weight transfer, which you're stuck with. How do you use that to your advantage? Now, where weight transfer too much can be a problem is that if the weight transfer is more than the amount of weight that's on the tyre, you're going to wheel stand. Now, once you've done a wheel stand, there's no weight on the front tyre, all the weight's on the back. You can't accelerate any harder. So too much weight transfer, when you get wheel stands, if you guys remember back to rear motor days, you're kind of limited. You get more initial bite, but if your weight's too far further back or there's too much weight transfer, you'll get wheel standing, and then that kind of limits the amount of acceleration you can have. And that's one of the reasons on very high grip tracks like carpet surfaces, we run more weight forward, because then there's more weight to lift, so we can accelerate faster before wheel standing. So for example, doing this calculation of a current B6.3D with a layback transmission versus an old rear motor layout, this will take about 2.5G to wheel stand. A rear motor car with about 33% on the front was more like 1.9 or 2G. So these cars will actually accelerate harder, but you need to use this technique to get the weight onto the rear tyre first. Now in four-wheel drive, it's the same phenomena that happens, but when we have too much weight transfer, the front tyres are getting light. It means we're not getting as much traction out of them, and especially if you've got a centre differential, it means it'll spin the centre diff much easier, so we have to run a much thicker centre diff oil. So weight transfer under acceleration, we're stuck with it. It's there. We can use it to our advantage, especially on a two-wheel drive car. Now, in cornering, it's the same phenomena. If you imagine when we're going around a corner, it's our tires that are pushing this way and our center of gravity is trying to lean outwards. So it's the same, the weight transfer is caused by the same thing. The tire force is lower than the center of gravity. So that creates a moment, which creates a weight transfer. And we see weight transfer, the outside tires get increased weight and the inside tires get decreased weight. Again, using the example of this 6.3D, if we are taking, the track width is about 200 millimeters. So the cars are a bit narrower than they are long. So the track width of about 200 millimeters at a 1.5 G cornering. We're going to start, if this is right hand and left hand side here, we're going to start with about 800 grams on each side in blue. And then with the weight transfer, we're going to end up now, it's about 540 grams of weight transfer. 1600 grams times 1.5 G, 45 mil height, divide 200 mil, gives you 540 grams of weight transfer. So now the inside of the car is about 260 grams and the outside is about 1340 grams. So we've got weight transfer to the outside. Now, if the weight transfer is too much, if this starts to go down to zero, you're going to start traction rolling. So on carpet, that's what we want. It's really important to lower the center of gravity. So we run the cars really, really low on those very high grip tracks. On a low grip track, it's not quite so important because you often are using a bit higher ride height to give yourself more forward acceleration. So we're stuck with weight transfer to the outside of the car. Now, before I go too much further, I want to explain one little extra point about tire traction that I didn't explain in my first video. And that is that the amount of traction you have on a tire, it goes up as you put weight onto the tire, but it doesn't go up quite as much as you put the weight on. So it's not 100% linear. What I mean by that is if you as you start to put more weight on, the grip goes up, but not quite as much. Twice as much weight on a tire doesn't give you twice as much traction. As you take weight off, you actually start to lose more traction by taking weight off than adding weight on. So in this situation, the total weight of the car is still the same, but we've now got one side of the car that's really heavily loaded and one side lightly loaded. We're actually going to also reduce some tire traction in this because these outside tires haven't gained quite as much traction as the inside tire. So more weight transfer actually takes away traction in the middle of the corner. The less weight transfer you can have, the inside tire works harder than what you gain on the outside tire by having more weight transfer. But this can work to our advantage in terms of how we tune the car. So when we're going through a corner, both the front and the rear are being rolled as the car leans to the outside, or in the case of a go-kart, they don't actually roll. But the weight's transferring to the outside. Now, we can balance how much stiffness is taken on the front and the rear suspension. So if we have exactly the same stiffness front and rear, when we go through a corner, both the front and rear are going to resist the same amount of weight transfer. So they'll both share about the same amount of weight transfer. If we, for example, make the front much, much stiffer and the rear really soft, when the car goes and you get weight transfer in the corner, there's going to be a lot more weight transfer felt by the front suspension than the rear suspension. The rear suspension is the weight's almost going to stay the same. So in this case, you've now got a big weight transfer to the outside front tire and off the inside front tire, not so much across the rear. So that difference in tire traction, you're now making the front tires much more unequally loaded. They're going to get less efficient. And that's how you can have less traction on the front, balance that with more on the rear. Vice versa, if we make the rear really stiff, as we go through a corner, it's going to get a big weight transfer and not so much on the front. You have less relative traction on the rear than the front. So when it comes to cornering, we can start to use how much weight transfer, how we share that weight transfer around the car. We can use that to change the balance of the car. So it's a powerful tool in terms of balance of the vehicle. Now, this has all the discussion here so far has been about static weight transfer, purely accelerating and purely cornering. More like the midpoint of a corner is statically. When we are first accelerating, when we're first turning in the corner, there's a lot of dynamics that come in. I'll cover that in the next video because that's a little bit more complex. You start to have roll centers, springs, and shock absorbers. But for now, I just want you to keep take away the basics of weight transfer. Weight transfer happens because of the basic physics. The tyre force is at the ground and the center of gravity is above the ground. So when we want to accelerate the center of gravity, that difference in height of the center of gravity creates a torque that pushes one end of the car down and pulls one end of the car up. The basic maths, it's the force multiplied by the center of gravity height divided by the wheelbase or the track. Lower center of gravity height gives you less weight transfer. Shorter track or shorter wheelbase gives you more weight transfer. Under acceleration, weight transfer can help a two-wheel drive harder forward harder. In cornering, weight transfer tends to take away grip, and we can change how much weight transfer happens front and rear. I hope this has been an interesting article for you on weight transfer, why it occurs and how we can use it. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comment below or send me a message at either my Facebook page, Ask Ray Munday, or send to me directly. And then it'll be in the next week or two, I'll put out another video on the dynamic weight transfer. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you get something out of it. See ya.